It started with a buzzing sound, a faint hum that grew louder as I pulled into my driveway one Friday evening. At first, I thought it was just a neighbor's lawnmower or some distant construction project. But as I stepped out of my car, I noticed something unusual. A thin, metallic wire stretched taut across the entrance to my property, barely visible in the fading light. My stomach sank as realization dawned. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. Someone had installed an electric fence right in my driveway. The audacity of it left me speechless. Who would do such a thing? And why? As I examined the setup more closely, I spotted a small sign attached to one of the posts. Private property, do not enter. The irony stung. This wasn't private property. It was my driveway. Anger bubbled up inside me. But before I could act on impulse, I reminded myself to stay calm. Whatever this was about, reacting rashly wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I grabbed my phone and snapped photos of the fence, documenting every detail for evidence. Then I called the police. While waiting for them to arrive, I texted a few neighbors to see if anyone knew what was going on. Most were as baffled as I was, though one hinted that the HOA might be involved. They've been talking about enforcing boundaries at recent meetings, she wrote cryptically. That didn't make sense. Our neighborhood association typically dealt with aesthetic concerns like lawn maintenance and mailbox colors, not installing electrified barriers in people's driveways. Still, the timing seemed suspicious. Over the past few months, tensions between me and certain members of the HOA board had escalated due to disagreements over proposed rule changes. Could this be retaliation? When the officers arrived, they confirmed my suspicions. The fence was live, emitting a low-voltage current designed to deter intruders without causing serious harm. While technically legal under local ordinances with proper permits, its placement violated multiple zoning laws and constituted trespassing since it encroached on my property. They promised to investigate further, advising me to contact the HOA directly for clarification. Reluctantly, I agreed, though I doubted they'd admit responsibility outright. The next morning, armed with coffee and determination, I attended the weekly HOA meeting, an event I usually avoided unless absolutely necessary. Sure enough, the room buzzed with tension as soon as I walked in. Eyes darted toward me. Whispers filled the air, and Harold Peterson, the ever-meddlesome president of the board, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. When it was my turn to speak, I laid out the facts plainly, presenting the photos and explaining how the fence obstructed access to my home. This isn't just inconvenient, I said firmly. It's illegal, and frankly, it's dangerous. What if someone accidentally touched it? Or worse, what if a child wandered into it? Harold squirmed visibly but maintained his composure. We were simply following protocol, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. There have been reports of unauthorized vehicles using your driveway as a shortcut. We thought installing a temporary barrier would discourage that behavior. Temporary? The industrial-grade wiring suggested otherwise. Protocol? Since when did enforcing minor traffic infractions justify violating property rights? His excuses rang hollow, especially given the animosity we'd exchanged during previous debates. Clearly, this wasn't about shortcuts. It was personal. But here's the twist neither Harold nor anyone else in that room anticipated. Unbeknownst to most of them, I wasn't just Sarah Thompson, suburban homeowner and occasional PDA volunteer. I was also Senator Sarah Thompson, representing a district 3 counties away. Politics hadn't been part of my original plan. I entered public service almost accidentally, spurred by a desire to advocate for civil liberties after years of navigating systemic inequities, as a single mother raising 2 kids on a tight budget. Yet here I was, reduced to arguing with petty bureaucrats over something as absurd as an electric fence blocking my driveway. As the meeting dragged on, frustration mounted. Neighbors divided along predictable lines. Those who sided with Harold, viewing me as an outsider disrupting their carefully curated suburban utopia, and those sympathetic to my plight, outraged by the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. Tempers flared, accusations flew, and by the time the session adjourned, no resolution had been reached. If anything, the divide between us felt wider than ever. That night, unable to sleep, I drafted a statement, not to Harold or the HOA board, but to the press. In it, I recounted the events leading up to the fence installation, framing it not as an isolated incident, but as symptomatic of broader issues plaguing homeowners associations nationwide: unchecked power, lack of transparency, and disregard for individual rights. Before hitting send, I hesitated, weighing the potential consequences. Going public meant sacrificing the anonymity I'd worked so hard to preserve. It meant inviting scrutiny not only of the HOA's actions, but of mine as well. Yet, deep down, I knew it was the right thing to do. If sharing my story could shine a light on systemic injustices and prevent others from facing similar treatment, then exposing the truth was worth whatever backlash might follow. By sunrise, the article had gone viral. Headlines blared across national news outlets. Senator's driveway blocked by electric fence installed by HOA, and power struggle erupts between feared politician and suburban bureaucrats. Social media exploded with outrage. Hashtags like #NoBullying trending within hours. Reporters camped outside my house, eager for interviews, while angry constituents flooded Harold's voicemail, demanding accountability. Even fellow politicians weighed in, offering support and vowing to introduce legislation curbing HOA abuses. For better or worse, my quiet suburban existence had been thrust into the spotlight. Harold, predictably, tried to defend himself, issuing a statement claiming the fence was a miscommunication and accusing me of exploiting the situation for political gain. His attempts to shift blame only fueled the firestorm, drawing further criticism from advocates for property rights and government oversight. Meanwhile, updates on the investigation trickled in slowly. Local authorities confirmed that the HOA lacked the necessary permits for the fence and issued fines accordingly. Yet, removing the barrier proved easier said than done. Dismantling it required specialized equipment, which delayed progress indefinitely. As days turned into weeks, the fallout rippled outward, affecting not just Harold and me, but the entire neighborhood. Tensions ran high, dividing residents into factions: those who supported stricter regulations on HOAs and harsher penalties for negligence, and those who sided with Harold, arguing that property owners had a right to enforce rules, even draconian ones. Amidst the turmoil, I struggled to balance my roles as a victim of bureaucratic overreach, a politician under intense scrutiny, and a neighbor caught in the crossfire of a deeply polarized debate. Little did I know, however, that the real battle was only beginning, and that its outcome would hinge not on anger or vengeance, but on forgiveness and understanding. The media firestorm ignited by the electric fence incident transformed what should have been a minor neighborhood dispute into a national spectacle. Reporters swarmed my street, microphones thrust toward anyone willing to comment on the growing feud between me and the HOA. Neighbors became reluctant celebrities, quoted in newspapers, and interviewed on local TV segments, dissecting the drama. Some embraced the attention, eager to share their grievances about HOA overreach. Others retreated behind closed doors, fearful of being dragged further into the controversy. Meanwhile, Harold Peterson, once the self-appointed enforcer of suburban order, found himself vilified as the poster child for bureaucratic tyranny. Harold's attempts to mitigate the damage grew increasingly desperate and increasingly tone-deaf. In a televised interview, he doubled down on his earlier claims, insisting that the fence was a temporary measure intended to protect property values, and accusing me of using my political influence to bully the HOA. "She's not one of us," he declared, gesturing vaguely at the camera. "She doesn't understand our community or its needs." His words sparked outrage, particularly among critics who pointed out the hypocrisy of an organization ostensibly dedicated to preserving harmony, resorting to such divisive tactics. Worse still, his comments inadvertently highlighted the classist undertones of the conflict, framing me as an outsider intruding upon their carefully curated enclave simply because I didn't conform to their narrow definition of belonging. But Harold wasn't the only one making missteps. As the story gained traction, so too did calls for accountability from both sides. Supporters rallied around me, urging me to leverage my position as a senator to dismantle the HOA entirely or impose stricter regulations on similar organizations statewide. Petitions circulated online, demanding everything from criminal charges against Harold to mandatory training programs for HOA boards across the country. While flattering, the pressure weighed heavily on me. This wasn't just about vindication anymore. It was about setting a precedent, proving that no institution, no matter how small or seemingly innocuous, was above scrutiny. Caught between public expectation and personal principle, I wrestled with how best to respond. On one hand, I wanted justice, not just for myself, but for anyone else who might fall victim to unchecked authority masked as community governance. On the other hand, I worried that escalating conflict would only deepen divisions within the neighborhood, alienating neighbors who already viewed me with suspicion due to my political status. Balancing these concerns proved challenging, especially as the spotlight intensified. One evening, after another exhausting day fielding questions from reporters and strategizing with legal advisors, I received an unexpected visitor, Margaret Peterson, Harold's wife. She stood nervously on my porch, clutching a basket filled with homemade cookies and a handwritten note. Her message was simple yet profound. I'm sorry for everything. Please know that not everyone in this family agrees with Harold's actions. We hope you can find a way to forgive him and us. Reading her words, I felt a pang of sympathy. Like me, Margaret was caught in a situation beyond her control, forced to bear the consequences of someone else's choices. Unlike Harold, however, she seemed genuinely remorseful, acknowledging the harm done without resorting to excuses or blame shifting. Margaret's gesture gave me pause, prompting me to reconsider how I approached the situation. While accountability remained crucial, perhaps there was room for dialogue alongside demand for justice. With that thought in mind, I reached out to the HOA board, proposing a town hall meeting to address the issues raised by the incident. My goal wasn't to vilify Harold or rally support for punitive measures, but rather to foster understanding and promote meaningful change. To my surprise, the board agreed, scheduling the event for the following weekend. The night of the town hall, the community center buzzed with anticipation. Residents packed the room, spilling into overflow seating areas as cameras rolled and microphones crackled. Emotions ran high, with some attendees shouting accusations, while others pleaded for calm. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped onto the stage, gripping the podium tightly to steady my nerves. Behind me, a slideshow displayed images of my driveway before and after fence installation, juxtaposed with statistics about HOA abuses nationwide. As the photos flashed across the screen, murmurs rippled through the crowd, softening the tension ever so slightly. I stand here today not as a senator, I began, but as a neighbor, a mother, and someone whose life has been forever changed by the events of recent weeks. What happened to me wasn't just an accident. It was a symptom of deeper problems plaguing our society. Fear of difference, lack of transparency, and a culture that prioritizes conformity over compassion. But tonight, we have an opportunity to confront those challenges head-on and work toward solutions that benefit everyone. For the next hour, I outlined proposals aimed at preventing similar incidents in the future. These included mandatory training sessions for HOA members on fair housing laws and civil rights, stricter enforcement of permitting processes for structural modifications, and the establishment of a neighborhood task force dedicated to fostering inclusivity and mutual respect. I emphasized that these measures weren't about punishing Harold or anyone else, but about creating a safer, more compassionate community for all residents. By the time I finished speaking, the room had fallen silent, the hostility replaced by thoughtful reflection. Harold, seated near the back of the auditorium, rose hesitantly to respond. For the first time since the incident, he appeared genuinely contrite, his usual bravado replaced by humility. I never intended to hurt anyone, he admitted, his voice cracking with emotion. And I certainly didn't mean to cause so much pain, not just to Sarah, but to everyone affected by this mess. If I could take it all back, I would in a heartbeat. He went on to pledge his cooperation with any reforms proposed by the task force, vowing to educate himself and others about property rights and government oversight. Though his apology couldn't undo the damage, it marked a critical step toward reconciliation. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to heal. The HOA implemented many of the changes I'd suggested, hosting workshops and distributing informational materials to raise awareness about homeowners' rights and responsibilities. Neighbors who had previously avoided me started reaching out, offering condolences and volunteering to help remove the remnants of the fence. Even Harold made amends, visiting my home one afternoon to personally apologize, bringing along a toolbox and offering to assist with repairs. Though wary at first, I accepted his gesture, recognizing it as a sincere effort to make things right. Still, the road ahead remained uncertain. The attention surrounding the case continued to weigh heavily on me, forcing me to navigate complex ethical dilemmas as both a private citizen and a public figure. Yet, amidst the uncertainty, one truth became clear. Healing required more than justice. It demanded empathy, patience, and a commitment to rebuilding trust. Little did I know, however, that the final chapter of the story would bring yet another twist, one that tested not only my resilience but also my capacity for forgiveness. Months passed, and life in the neighborhood slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, or at least as close to normal as it could get after such a public spectacle. The electric fence was dismantled, its remnants carted away like evidence of a crime scene. My driveway, once a battleground for power struggles and ideological clashes, became just another stretch of asphalt connecting my home to the outside world. Yet, the emotional scars lingered longer than the physical ones. Trust, once broken, is difficult to repair, especially when betrayal comes within your own community. Harold's transformation over those months surprised even me. After his public apology at the town hall meeting, he threw himself into reforming the HOA, working tirelessly to undo years of entrenched practices that prioritize control over collaboration. He attended workshops on fair housing laws, invited civil rights advocates to speak at board meetings, and implemented transparency measures designed to give residents a greater voice in decision-making. While some neighbors remained skeptical, convinced his efforts were merely an attempt to salvage his reputation, I couldn't deny the sincerity of his actions. For better or worse, Harold had become an unlikely ally in the fight for systemic change. But the real turning point came not through grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but through something far simpler: connection. One crisp autumn afternoon, as I raked leaves in my front yard, Jake Peterson, the same teenager who had reached out during Max's recovery, approached me hesitantly. Clutching a sketch pad, he asked if he could draw the oak tree that stood proudly in my yard. "It's for a school project," he explained, his voice tinged with nervousness. "I've always admired how it looks in different seasons." Intrigued, I invited him to sit on the porch while he worked. As he sketched, we talked, not about politics or property disputes, but about art, school, and the challenges of growing up in a household defined by controversy. Jake confessed that watching his father spiral into infamy had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege, responsibility, and the consequences of unchecked power. "Sometimes," he admitted, "I feel like I'm living in someone else's shadow. Like no matter what I do, people will always see me as Harold's kid." His vulnerability resonated deeply with me. As a politician, I understood all too well the weight of association, the assumptions people make based on family ties or shared affiliations. But unlike Jake, I'd chosen my path. Harold's choices weren't mine to bear. Still, hearing him articulate his struggles reminded me of the importance of separating individuals from their circumstances. Just as I didn't want to be judged solely by my title as a senator, Jake deserved the chance to define himself apart from his father's mistakes. Inspired by our conversation, I decided to take a bold step toward reconciliation. With winter approaching, I hosted a small gathering at my house, an informal neighborhood potluck aimed at fostering goodwill and rebuilding relationships. To my surprise, nearly everyone showed up, including Harold and Margaret. The evening began awkwardly, with polite small talk and cautious glances exchanged across folding tables laden with casseroles and desserts. But as the hours passed, barriers began to fall. Stories were shared, laughter echoed through the room, and old grudges dissolved in the warmth of shared humanity. Harold, perhaps emboldened by the relaxed atmosphere, approached me near the end of the night, holding a plate of cookies, a peace offering perhaps. He thanked me for extending the invitation. "I know I don't deserve it," he said quietly, "but I appreciate you giving me and us a second chance." His words carried a sincerity I hadn't heard before, signaling a willingness to grow rather than dig in his heels. For the first time since the incident, I saw him not as an adversary, but as a person capable of change. By spring, the neighborhood bore little resemblance to the fractured place it had been just a year earlier. Friendships formed across divides, old wounds healed, and new traditions emerged. The annual block party, once a source of tension due to strict HOA regulations, transformed into a celebration of diversity and unity, complete with adaptive activities for residents with disabilities. Harold, no longer president but still active in the HOA, spearheaded these changes, earning back some measure of respect from those he'd alienated. For me, the transformation was equally profound. While the electric fence incident had thrust me into the national spotlight, it also forced me to confront vulnerabilities I'd long buried beneath layers of professionalism and poise. Advocating for justice, and by extension myself, taught me the importance of vulnerability as a catalyst for connection. It reminded me why I entered politics in the first place. Not to wield power, but to amplify voices often ignored or silenced. And perhaps most importantly, it reinforced the idea that forgiveness isn't a sign of weakness, but an act of courage, a choice to move forward despite pain, uncertainty, and fear. As I stood on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon and cast golden light across my driveway, I reflected on how far we'd come. What began as a tragedy had evolved into a story of redemption, not just for me, but for Harold, Jake, and the entire neighborhood. We hadn't erased the past, nor should we have tried. Instead, we'd woven its lessons into the tapestry of our collective future, using them to build something stronger, kinder, and more resilient. In the end, justice wasn't about punishment or retribution. It was about restoration, about finding beauty in brokenness and meaning in loss, about realizing that even in our darkest moments, there exists a potential for light, if only we're brave enough to seek it.